Malaria is not particularly common in Arusha and the region sort of where Kilimanjaro is located in. In fact, the prevalence of malaria around the Arusha region is only about 0.4%. Compare that with the HIV prevalence, for example, which is around 5.1%. So, in fact, a casual sexual encounter in that region is probably far more dangerous than the risk of being bitten by a mosquito and developing malaria. And indeed, once you get above 1,800 meters, you very rarely find mosquitoes, and so the risk of malaria decreases quite substantially. So you can make a good argument if you're prepared to take a lot of care and attention to avoiding being bitten by a mosquito, that mosquito avoidance may in fact be far more preferable than taking a lot of complex anti-malarial drugs, often for many, many weeks. There's also no yellow fever in that region either. However, if you are traveling into Tanzania from a country where yellow fever is endemic, or you transit through that country, even for as little as 12 hours, then you will need to have a yellow fever vaccination and carry a yellow fever certificate. Okay, let's start to talk about how we define altitude. We define low altitude as being in the order of 1,500 meters or less above sea level. Intermediate altitude is 1,500 to 2,500 meters. Now, at this sort of level, you do start to get some physiological changes occurring, but they're really quite subtle, and generally speaking, they're not going to be of any clinical relevance. Your SATs are going to be well above 90%, and whilst altitude illness is theoretically possible, it essentially doesn't occur. Once you get above 2,500 meters and you're heading to the 3,500 meter mark, now you're in what we would define as a high altitude zone. And certainly if you ascend to these altitudes quickly, there is a potential for altitude illness to develop. Now, at these sort of altitudes, some degree of altitude illness would be common, but it's usually going to be relatively minor. Very high altitude is 3,500 to 5,800 meters, and these are the levels now where you start to get very significant effects. Altitude illness is common, and when it occurs, it can be quite severe. There can be quite marked hypoxemia, and SATs can certainly be below 90%. The picture here is one I took when I was climbing Mont Blanc, which is the highest mountain in Western Europe, and it's a fantastic sort of final ascent up to the summit. And in fact, when you stand on this sort of ridge, if you were to fall, you can fall one way and you'd actually eventually end up in Italy, and if you fall off the opposite side, you would eventually end up in France. Of course, the aim is not to fall at all. And then extreme altitude is really over 5,800 meters. And somewhere between 5,500 and 5,800 meters, you reach this point where you will progressively deteriorate. In other words, you cannot survive indefinitely above these altitudes, even with optimum acclimatization. And that's why when you're climbing really big mountains, you've got to plan your acclimatization and then obviously plan your summit and get down back below sort of 5,500 meters as quickly as possible before you develop significant deterioration and all the adverse effects that will entail. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail shortly. All right, this is a good picture in the sense of illustrating some of the overcrowding that can occur on mountains. This is the start of one of the trails leading up Kilimanjaro, and you can see here this kind of Congo line of porters extending all the way down to this terminal hut here where a road accesses and allows trekkers and guides and porters, etc., to be dropped off to start their trek. And this line, in fact, will be heading up in the opposite direction with just as many people as you can see in this photo. All right, so having had a little bit of a preamble in regards to Kilimanjaro itself, let's talk a little bit about the physiological response to altitude. Generally speaking, people start to show some kind of physiological response at around 2,000 meters, but it's variable. and the degree of response varies from person to person. But once you get to 3,000 meters, everybody shows a response. Everybody shows the same type of response. It's just the degree by which they respond that varies, and that's what determines how well they may or may not acclimatize, and we'll talk about that in a bit more depth shortly.